Hello and welcome to yet another video. This is the third episode of the story, and when Naruto's father met his mother, his first thought was that a village out there must be missing its idiot. This story is from Silver Shine. Please support him, her. Please like and subscribe to show your support. Let's get the show started. Dear Hokage-sama, you ask that I keep you abreast of a certain young man's situation out here on the Firewater borderlands, but I imagine that by the time this letter reaches you, you may already have heard more than I can tell you in coded correspondence. This one has a reputation that tends to precede him. Let us just say that he is a bright boy, as expected from a child of that woman. He is quick to comprehend strategy and faultlessly obedient. He gets on well with others, even the most difficult of us, and from what I have observed he is kind, generous, and hygienic, which is all I can ask of my people here. It is difficult to complain about him, but since you'll desire to know even the smallest defect, I would have to say that sometimes he is slow to speak his mind and offer insight. When he does find the courage to speak, he always has something fairly wise and balanced to say, so I don't fear he holds back out of simple-mindedness but out of natural diffidence. He has been more forthcoming in recent weeks, however, as he grows more familiar with his comrades and superiors. Currently, he is best at following orders and all a commander could ask for. I reserve my judgment about his leadership qualities. It is plain to see people gravitate towards him, some twice his age or more, and admire him greatly for his skill. He could easily have a lot of sway if he chooses to utilize it, but until he learns more confidence, I would say he is quite unprepared for what you have in mind for him. Yours faithfully, Shimura Danzu. The marshes were always quiet at night, but they were never truly silent. If it wasn't the distant snores and shuffling of the sleeping camp behind them, it was the marsh itself that rustled with little noises and the unseen splashes of nocturnal animals hidden away in the mist. Being put on watch was a very misleading assignment. The mist was so thick out here that even on a clear night with the full moon beaming down on land, it was impossible to see more than 100 yards. Vision was a near useless sense on the Kiri marshland. Here, you had to depend almost entirely on your hearing alone, and trust your intuition to know the difference between one ripple of water and the next, for one could be nothing more than an eel gliding close to the surface, and another could be the enemy closing in to end your life. Naturally, Minato had other more reliable ways of detecting enemy incursions, and so tonight he was relaxed in the bough of a hazel tree, examining his toes. A rumor had been going around the camp for as long as he'd been here that these marshes had unnatural properties. Most of the Kiri ninja they captured, dead or alive, were such strange-looking fellows. They sharpened their teeth to frightening points, and some were so white and slimy-looking they were practically amphibian. Several even had quite real webbing between their fingers and toes. No one knew how they'd done this to themselves, if they had, so it was a matter of bodily integrity not to wash in the marsh water, for it was widely believed that if you dipped your feet too long in these cold, foggy pools, you'd soon turn into a frog. Minato made sure to examine his toes every night. So far so good, no webbing. On the branch above him came a great sigh. Nara Shikaku was always easily bored by watch duty, and he'd only been here a month. But tonight's sigh did not seem like one of dismay, but of wistful longing. Do you think she has a boyfriend back home? Shikaku suddenly asked. Minato was faintly startled by the intrusion of conversation into a task that was always to be conducted in strict silence. He cast around quickly for any sign of life nearby, then ventured a hushed response. Who? Yoshino. Minato flicked a moth off his hand. You mean the one in the communications unit? Is there any other? Well, there's Yoshino in the 3rd Strike Unit, and there was a Yoshino who was sent home a few weeks ago because she lost her hand, so, never mind. Yes, the one in the communications unit. The pretty one. Minato said nothing. He had never thought Yoshino was particularly attractive, just kinda tall and thin and supremely bossy. There were few times he'd ever seen her when she wasn't shouting down the communication lines to some poor sap at another outpost. But maybe Shikaku liked that sort of girl? She knows 12 different water country dialects, you know. She's a smart girl. That was probably exaggerating a little, but just knowing one missed dialect was more than what Minato and Shikaku knew put together, so it was still pretty impressive. Doesn't she remind you of a drill sergeant, though? Minato asked him. She's not afraid to tell people what they should be doing, it's true, Shikaku sighed. Minato went back to his toes with an air of finality. You should definitely marry her then. What? The tree shivered as Shikaku bolted upright to peer down at him. Only someone like a drill sergeant could motivate you to do anything. If you marry someone like you, you'll never get anything done. If you marry Yoshino, you'll be whipped into shape in no geez, I'm not talking about marriage, Minato, Shikaku gasped. She doesn't even know I exist. Suit yourself, Minato said tiredly. So many of the conversations he had with his friends these days boiled down to girls, and Shikaku was the worst. From one day to the next, he would go from loudly declaring that dating was a pointless exercise in futility for losers who would accomplish no more than collecting a list of bitter exes, to waxing lyrical about the newest female recruit's backside. If he didn't want to date, and he obviously didn't want to be asexual, perhaps marriage was what he was after? But Minato didn't really want to encourage this line of conversation. It was bad enough that he had to be kept awake at night whenever Yutane Kid snuck into her boyfriend's bunk and did things non-tuquietly that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He didn't really want to assist in pairing anyone else up too. Above him, Shikaku sighed again. Do you think she likes poems? I'm pretty good with things like that. Minato was almost grateful when he felt something hit the periphery of his senses. One of his figurative tripwires had been tripped. Quickly and quietly, he slipped off the branch and landed on the soft, boggy moss. Shikaku, he whispered, there's a scout crossing the delta. Go wake the commander and I'll see if I can head him off. Can't you wake the commander? Shikaku asked hopefully. Between facing an unknown enemy hidden in the mist and waking their crotchety boss, Minato thought he had the better deal. Just go. He set off into the mist, silently moving across the flooded landscape, between rushes and sedges and twisted hazel boughs. The same figure unwittingly passed through another trap to the east. They were heading along a straight route towards the camp, and Minato changed direction to intercept. There was no chance his quarry could know he was being tracked. No had not yet managed to detect Minato's jutsu. After a few minutes, Minato paused behind a clump of tall grass and listened. If the scout had continued along the same trajectory, he would soon be passing through a third trap about 300 meters away. Minato waited, peering hard into the impenetrable mist. There. A tiny flicker of a bare foot passing over water cress, and then nothing. The scout had almost escaped the range of his tag, and Minato frowned. If he could just widen its range a few more meters, he could. Okay, this wasn't the time to work on his jutsu. The scout was coming. He could hear him now, a soft panting of someone who had probably swam the distance between the first island to the mainland river delta. This would be pretty easy, he thought. The tired ones were always the quickest to take out, and this one was alone. Then the panting stopped and silence fell once more. Minato stayed still. Had he been detected? Minutes passed. He ventured out from the grasses and across the surface of the pool. Mist closed in around him like a white sheet, obscuring everything beyond the end of his nose. These were not conditions to his advantage. He performed a swift wind jutsu to blow the thick fog away, and suddenly the marsh around him came into crystal clear focus. Yet there was no scout to be seen. But Minato had definitely heard him. Suddenly two cold blue hands reached out of the water and dragged him under. The war had not been going well when Minato had arrived at the delta. The people he was joining were unanimously weary and depressed. Of the 10 original outposts along the coast, 3 had been obliterated and 2 had merged to compensate for lost numbers. Kiri forces had staked a post at the edge of the delta that was a geographical nightmare to attack. The campaign had been going on for 15 years. And this was the first time that Minato had comprehended that Konoha was losing. The news back home had been that the Fire Country was holding the line admirably. In reality, Minato could see these men and women were perhaps just another year or 2 away from total defeat. The war with the Rain Country had sapped vital reserves and morale, almost certainly accelerating the slow erosion of the territory lines on this side of the country. The commander of the Eastern Front was one Shimura Danzu. A one-eyed man about the same age as the Hokage who rarely left his tent. He was originally head of an ultra-secretive ANBU division back home in Konoha, but for some reason the Hokage had seen fit to send him to the furthest border. In his first week, Minato had been updated about all the gossip by his friendly bunkmate Shinobi Tyson, and he learned that the commander might have been sent out here not to aid the war with his expertise, but because the Hokage feared his influence at home. Nevertheless, Danzu seemed a competent commander. As soon as Minato arrived he was put to work guarding the food stores. Initially he'd thought this was a job for a guard dog, not a chunin, but by the end of his first week he'd been attacked twice by Kiri saboteurs. He'd held his ground so well, defeating both attempts without even needing to call for aid, that Danzu had quickly set him the task of sabotaging the food supplies of Kiri's outpost. Minato had been instructed at great length what he was to do, and though he would be going with several seasoned chunin, he knew this was a difficult task that would be quite a blow to the enemy for all its simplicity. Unfortunately, no one had succeeded yet. Minato's team was the first. The plan had been this: while the rest of the team created a diversion, Minato was to sneak into the outpost, spoil their water supplies and compromise their preserves. His team performed their part with dedication, and 2 of them died in the process. Minato snuck into the food bunker under the guise of the strongest genjutsu he possessed and proceeded to discreetly prick open every packet of food and pop every can of rations, before proceeding to dump the poison Danzu had given him into the water tank. It would only be a matter of days before the Kiri discovered the water contamination and fixed it, but the contamination of the food would be weeks in the making and far more difficult to replace. The best Konoha could hope for were widespread stomach cramps, but Danzu and everyone else seemed assured that this was worth the effort. An army marched on its stomach, they said. The ugly truth was that more wars had been lost thanks to diarrhea than to superior fighting forces. Whether this had attributed to their success in overwhelming the Kiri outpost a few weeks later would never be known, but it was a hard-won victory and Shinobi Tyson had been killed in a hail of kunai. Their reward, however, was the re-establishment of the original border and juicy intelligence plundered from the Kiri commander's tent. Minato had thought this was it, and their job was merely to defend the border. But Danzu was not content to win back one scrap of land. He wanted to win islands that had been part of the water country for centuries. In fact, it was clear he wanted to defeat Kiri in its entirety and bring their whole country under the rule of the Fire Country. No one was in any position to argue. And so within months of arriving at the border and growing accustomed to one way of war, he was suddenly thrown into a whole new kind of game. Defense was very different from offense. The feeling he'd had when he'd been holding his ground against those who would poison his food and when he'd helped retake the Kiri outpost was a very different feeling when he was sent out with a squadron of 30 chunin and instructed to kill every Kiri on the first island and claim it at last for the Fire Country. This was for peace, he told himself. The Kiri were barbarians who made their children fight to the death in pits filled with blood and bones. Wherever they went, they brought destruction. Every inch Konoha took from them was an inch that was better off. He killed 22 people that night and let 5 escape, but after all that they failed to take the island. He wasn't sure how he felt when he returned to camp to wash the blood from his clothes. Glad that the order to retreat had arrived when it had, certainly. Yet still, he was disappointed at their failure. The lives he took never meant much to him. He did not enjoy it, but he didn't abhor it either. When an opponent came at him with a steely determination to kill him, he felt nothing but satisfaction of a good job done when he ended their life. There was nothing more to it than that. He did not, however, like it when the children came. The first time he'd come across one he had hesitated. He had known that the barbaric Kiri put their children through bloody trials, but he had not realized they were tools of war. Not until a particularly heavy invasion force came charging across the delta and Minato had engaged in his first full-out battle where loss didn't just mean a temporary retreat, but a loss of their outpost. He had cut his way across that battlefield, side by side with his teammates, with just one objective: kill any enemy he could. Then he'd turned around and a boy no more than 9 or 10 had come at him with teeth as sharp as the kunai in his hands. He couldn't kill him. Minato could not kill him. In those precious moments, he had choked, and the boy had driven a kunai into his arm. Danzu had been angry. Minato was marched into his tent the next day with his arm in a sling and had listened rigidly to his commander's disparaging lecture. Kiri used child soldiers for the sole purpose of making soft-hearted idiots like him hesitate, but there was no difference between a boy and a man. The boy would only grow up to be a stronger man. It was better to kill them while they were young, for they all grew up the same. So the next time he had come across a child in the middle of the battlefield, he had not hesitated. He had cracked her across the back of the skull with the flat of his hand and left her for someone else. Whether she would be killed by one of his comrades later or retrieved by hers was not his concern. He did not consider it a weakness to refrain from killing children, regardless of what Danzu said. Still, his first injury had put him in a difficult position. Since his first week he had written diligently to his friends back home. He wrote most enthusiastically to his sensei, about his commander, about the people he'd met and how the war on this side of the country was going, and his sensei frequently wrote back. Jiraiya's letters were always a delight. He had a way with words that could make even the most mundane things sound amusing and interesting, which was just as well since they were forbidden from talking in too much detail about what they were doing. Minato was regularly asked to read out his sensei's letter to his bunkmates, because they were closer to being short stories than simple updates, and everyone was keen to hear about the leader of the rain country, Hanzo, who was apparently a bit of a newt fancier and rode everywhere on a giant salamander. Minato stored each one carefully under his bedroll to reread whenever he felt low and lonely. He had kept his promise to write to Kushina every week, but herein lay his problem. He had also promised to inform her if he was ever injured, and even if doing so would probably only make her anxious or angry, he didn't want to lie. He scratched his head for several days, trying to find the right words. Got stabbed in the arm by a tiny kid, he eventually wrote. Nearly wet myself at the time. Hurts to write. To which she wrote back. Idiot. Which made Minato smile as he stored it with his sensei's letters. Although he wrote every week to her as promised, Kushina's responses were a little more sporadic. He understood that she was away from the village a lot doing missions and wouldn't receive his letters until she returned, but even so, when she did write, her letters were much more succinct and shorter than his own. She told him about her missions and made sure to tell him any and every embarrassment to befall her teammate Kagura. She mentioned her sensei's new son several times. Although he'd heard Kushina express disgust with babies before, she seemed quite taken with this one, and although the updates about herself were jerky and self-conscious, she wrote quite fluently about baby Kakashi's gorgeous eyes and perfect nose and pudgy fingers. She mentioned he strongly resembled her sensei. Minato immediately felt sorry for the kid. However, after his first year on the front lines, he was beginning to run out of things to say. The days tended to run together when little changed from day to day. Some days there were attacks. Other days they were the ones who attacked. Every other day was perfectly boring, and the most challenging task in his life was to keep himself entertained. So he had begun to work on a new jutsu, which involved using tags modeled on exploding tags that, instead of exploding, could be used to relay information. He had discovered that if he placed one of these tags inside his tent, wherever he went, he could always roughly tell if anyone entered. Gradually, he could begin to tell how many people were in the tent. Eventually, he could tell who was in his tent and what they were doing. He took his jutsu to Danzu and tried to explain it as best he could, but eventually his commander had just waved him off, saying that if he was confident he should utilize it however he wished. He was not like Jiraiya, who was always interested in Minato's ideas and happy to help him develop them, or even to learn a few things from his own student. Minato placed tags all over the delta and found them especially successful as a kind of early warning system to detect invasions or catch the odd scout. But this was literally all he had to write home about, and pretty quickly it was an exhausted topic. He stopped writing every week and stuck to writing letters at the end of every month. He doubted Kushina minded. She hadn't responded herself in weeks. He did not understand why until one of his bunkmates had arrived in their tent, calling names and lobbing letters at anyone who responded. Minato was hit square in the eye by a surprisingly thick envelope, and he felt a surge of inexplicable happiness when he recognized Kushina's awful handwriting. He was convinced she still wrote with the wrong hand just to spite everybody. By then his letters to and from Kushina were the stuff of an ongoing joke in this tent. Though he had reminded them all quite emphatically that Kushina was not his girlfriend, they still teased him mercilessly whenever he received a letter or was caught writing one to her. They often attempted to steal his messages and pretended to read them out in front of the others, and they always seemed to fall along the lines of, "Oh, Kushina, how the thought of your pretty face makes me moan in longing," when in fact his real letters were much more boring. Nothing Minato could say would convince them she was just a friend. "What's that? Another love letter from your sweetheart?" one bunkmate asked. "Quite a long one this time by the looks of it. Maybe it's a Dear John." "Shut up, guys," Minato sighed with an exasperated smile, tearing open the envelope to pull out the contents. He read the first line and the smile slid from his face. "Oh, God, she is breaking up with him," the first bunkmate gasped. Minato only wished that was the worst news he could have received. "Sakumo-sensei's wife died," Kushina wrote. "She died in April, but Suna only just released the body to us, so the funeral was this week. It's been horrible. Kakashi keeps calling for his mother and looking around, but now I think he's beginning to forget her. It doesn't seem fair. Perhaps it's better that he's too young to understand. I feel horrible though. He's never going to be able to know his mother now, and you'd think someone as kind as Rumiko-san deserves to be remembered by their own child. And I'm worried about Sensei. I've never seen him like this before and it scares me. Everyone just assumed he's managing okay, but I don't think he is. I don't think he's eating. I think the first time he left the house since we got the news was to go to the funeral, and he didn't look right. I don't know what to do, Minato. I don't know who to tell. Everyone just says he stopped taking missions because he has to look after Kakashi, but if it wasn't for that baby, I think he'd give up entirely. Kagura doesn't think there's anything wrong. She thinks Sensei's indestructible, but she's an idiot. She won't do anything for him and she has to, because I won't be in the village for much longer. I passed the Chunin exam a few weeks ago, but now I wish I hadn't taken it. They're going to send me to Waterfall when I need to be here for Sensei. And what's worse, Waterfall is where most of the Whirlpool refugees went. It's where the reformist cowards ran to after they destroyed everything. What if I end up fighting my old neighbors? I could end up fighting the people who killed my mother. I know there's nothing you can do, 500,000 miles away. I'm not sure you even knew Rumiko-san, so this probably means nothing to you and so I'm sorry for unloading. I guess what I'm also trying to say is that if you want to reach me, my new address will be the Waterfall border. Minato set the letter down on his lap and stared at the canvas walls of his tent as he thought. His bunkmates were still messing around, pretending to act out a love scene from a famous old romantic play, except the names had been changed to Minato and Kushina. Normally he might have been amused, but tonight he wanted to be alone. He left the tent and wandered the camp, struggling to compose a reply in his head. What did he say to her? Everything he could say in this situation just sounded trite and cliched, and he wasn't sure Kushina would like that. In the end he wrote that he was sorry for her loss, reassured her that her sensei would get back on his feet in time, and wished her well at her new post. It sounded so formal and empty, like it was something anyone else could have said. Would she mind? Had she been hoping for something more than generic tokens of condolences that she'd probably been hearing for weeks? He penned a little note to his own sensei too, asking if there was anything that could be done to help Hatake Tsukumo. Jiraiya's response was slow, but when it eventually came a few weeks later, Minato was glad to hear that Jiraiya had been in contact with Konoha and knew that Tsukumo was back on active duty and nearly back to his old self. Kushina, however, had yet to respond. He wrote again to her to relay Jiraiya's message in case she hadn't heard, but again she failed to reply. Minato knew it was harder to send personal messages from one warzone to another, but perhaps Kushina just had nothing to say to him now. In truth, it was the beginning of the end of their correspondence. Minato wrote her a few more times, mentioning how his new jutsu was improving in his hopes that it had the potential to summon objects or people or himself instantaneously across any distance. Kushina's responses were few and far between. She mentioned the weather, the beautiful sights, and the boredom. She mentioned that she was becoming friends with her new unit's captain, who she mentioned was one of the Hokage's nephews. And then he heard no more from her. Minato squelched back to camp with chattering teeth. Icy water dripped from his clothes and his hair and the tip of his nose, and his progress was hampered by the small corpse sluicing through the mud and the puddles behind him. Shikaku was the first to see him and came running forward. "There you are. Did you get him?" his friend asked, already peering down at the body Minato was dragging by the foot. "He's intact, right? You didn't give him time to destroy his secrets, did you?" "Yes," Minato said heavily, dropping his cargo on the bank of the camp where several other nin had gathered. As Minato pushed scraped strings of algae from his hair, Shikaku leant down with everyone else to check out the dead scout. "Shit, Minato," he whispered. "It's just a kid." "I noticed that," Minato said, sparing a small glance at the body of a boy who couldn't have been much older than 8 or 9. "Are you alright?" Shikaku asked. "Fine. He just got the jump on me, pulled me under the water." Minato flicked water off his fingers. "Now I'll probably turn into a newt or something." "No," said Shikaku, "I mean, the commander's coming," someone said softly, and all murmurs of conversation ceased as they looked up to see Danzu exiting his tent. He came towards them, flanked by 2 of his captains, and stopped to silently assess the body on the ground. "Who handled this one?" he asked quietly. Everyone looked at Minato, who squelched as he shifted his weight. "I did." Danzu appraised him with one dull eye before slowly shifting his attention to his captains. "Take this one to be autopsied," he said to them. Then he jerked his scarred chin at Minato, a clear command that he was to follow him back to his tent. Minato would rather have been allowed to shower first, but one did not keep the commander waiting. Inside the tent it was strikingly more comfortable than any other quarters. The walls were hung with insulating sheets of fabric painted with watercolors, and instead of the regular tarp floor of other tents that did little to soften the lumps and stones underneath, this floor was covered in quality mats that were firm and dry. Underfoot. Minato dripped on them shamelessly as he discreetly looked around at Danzu's opulent quarters, with his feather-stuffed cushions and chairs and antique cabinets and tables. Instead of dampness, he smelled sweet tea. Minato had almost forgotten such luxury existed, and suddenly he found himself aching for his room back home. "You have done well today," Danzu said to him as he moved an armful of scrolls of a sitting chair in order to recline in it. "You have overcome your hesitation and understand now what must be done." Minato stared at him, his face blank. To have an undamaged body in our possession will be very useful, his commander went on. You have your villages, thanks for helping to further our understanding of the enemy. Minato wasn't sure a child's body could hold enough secrets to help the war effort, but he supposed every little helped. He nodded his acceptance of the gratitude and waited for Danzu to dismiss him, but the commander seemed more interested in staring at him a little longer. Are you aware that the Hokage plans to retire soon? Danzu asked. Minato shook his head. He genuinely had not known that. You are currently one of the favored candidates to replace him. How do you feel about that? Minato lifted his shoulder in the slightest of shrugs. How did Danzu want him to feel about that? I admit I had my reservations at first, but I think I am beginning to see the potential in you. Great leaders do not let themselves be compromised by hesitation or misplaced mercy, they must be the embodiment of a perfect shinobi, and every great shinobi understands that he is a tool to be used by the will of the Hokage, that his emotions and personal desires come second to the Hokage's. Do you understand, Namikaze? Yes, Minato said. No Chunin will ever make a difference in this war, Danzu continued. Nor will any Jonin. Not even a commander like me amounts to anything more than the arm that wields the tools. All paths of power lead back to the Hokage. Only he can change the course of history. Only he can make a difference and save lives. Isn't that something to aspire to? I see the makings of a great man in you, Namikaze. I believe you could one day lead this petty, squabbling world of ours to peace. I tell you this not because I wish to flatter you, but because to first take your place in the world, you must understand it. If you are to be our next Hokage, and the most powerful, influential man in the world, I expect you to prove yourself soon enough. Yes, Commander, Minato answered bleakly, for he knew at once that he was a fraud. Danzu would have him feel proud for killing a child as dispassionately as any other, but he didn't know that Minato had acted not out of the cool logic required of a perfect tool, but the knee-jerk frenzy of one who feared for his life. He'd been dragged under the water and he'd been drowning. He'd grown complacent with his own power, assuming this opponent, like every other, would be no match for him. How could a child so much younger be so much stronger? Minato had lashed out in desperation and gotten lucky. When his breath had returned and he'd seen the small body floating in the water beside him, he'd been struck with a shock that had accompanied him all the way back to camp. Now here his commander was, extolling his virtues. Reminding him that Hokages didn't take lives, they saved them. How could he ever live up to that? Once Danzu dismissed him, Minato went straight to the showers and washed all the remaining slime and water beetles from his hair. Then he went straight to bed, passing Yoshi along the way, a girl from the 3rd Strike Unit not to be confused with Yoshino from the Communications Unit, who stumbled when she saw him and nearly dropped the freshly oiled batch of kunai she was carrying. Hi, Minato, she stammered. Oh. Hi. Minato forgot her the moment she was out of sight, and threw himself onto his hard bedroll once inside his tent. Most of his bunkmates were already in there, asleep, and so there was nothing to trouble Minato except a few snores that he'd long since learned to live with. Something dug into his collarbone, and Minato reached up to wrench off the good luck charm from around his neck to drop it into his bag. Luck may have saved him tonight, but if this was how it worked, Minato wanted no more of it. He fought valiantly for sleep that night, but every time he closed his eyes he saw nothing but the glassy dead eyes of that child staring back at him trough the murky water of the marsh. Usually Minato liked to keep his sensei up to date on his health and thoughts or seek his advice when he was troubled, but for once, Minato would not pick up his pen. He didn't want to tell Jiraiya that he'd killed a child, and that now whenever a new wave of enemies came over the horizon and his kunai found a new mark, he had doubts about what he was doing. For instance, what was really the difference between taking the life of a child and that of an adult? Why did life seem more precious the fewer years it had been on this planet? Surely those who were older, who had accumulated more life experience and responsibilities, who likely had people at home who loved and depended on them, were more valuable? If the people he was fighting were only here because, like him, they had been ordered to, were they really his enemies, or were they just another passive tool like one sword rebounding off another in the battlefield? He'd never thought long and hard about what he was doing out here. He was here because he'd been told to come here, and like a good shinobi he did all that was asked of him without question. He did not know who had started the war between Konoha and Kiri, he'd never really cared. Everyone he knew said it was Kiri, but what if everyone in Kiri was saying it was Konoha? But doubt in itself was pointless. He had to fight because if they lost the war they lost Konoha. When he met his opponent's eyes, he saw ferocity and a hatred that could not be extinguished with reason. Minato carried on killing because it was the only thing he could do, though sometimes at night he wanted to laugh at how ludicrous the world was. Killing to maintain peace. He used to think the ends justified the means, but for months now, years in fact, nothing had changed. There was no end to it. There just was no end. Mostly, however, he wondered if he was just scared. He knew he would not be forgetting any time soon the night when he was dragged beneath the water by a boy half his age, who flowed around him almost as if he too was water. Minato had been out of his element. He'd thought he was dead, and he'd lashed out without finesse or strategy. Only by pure dumb luck had he survived, and he still wasn't sure how. This wasn't like the time he'd nearly been assassinated by the Jonin from the Rain Country. Back then he'd still felt some acceptance that adults were stronger, that this was the natural order of things, but expected that when he became an adult, the threat would have passed. To find himself so close to mercy at the hands of a baby. For the first time in his life he was shaken, but his solution remained the same: he threw himself into training. It was not enough that he was already fast and strong and smart. He needed to be faster, and stronger, and smarter. He needed to approach every opponent as if it could be his last. There would be no more complacency, and no more underestimation of others. He felt ashamed, after Jiraiya had confided in him that power bred arrogance, but told Minato that he was different, because now he could see that his sensei was wrong. He'd always thought himself better than others. He'd shied from the responsibilities the Hokage had represented, and he'd naively assumed that just being a tool would be enough to change the world. That was where Danzu was right. Someone like him could not undo generations of hatred and war with only then a knife in his hand. This tool's life was just not enough for him anymore. When Shikaku him at the edge of the camp, tying tags to half a dozen kunai, he approached warily. "Hey, Minato," he greeted, lifting a nonchalant hand. "Hey," Minato responded without looking up. "Are you okay, man?" Shikaku asked him. Minato finally glanced at him in surprise. Of course, I am," he said. "Why?" Well, you seem kinda intense lately. I mean, you used to always be up for a laugh, but these days you seem so serious." Shikaku looked around the small clearing awkwardly. "Like, what are you doing now?" Minato palmed his kunai reflexively. "I'm working on my jutsu." "I thought you finished it," said Shikaku, frowning. "You told me you couldn't increase the range of detection anymore." "The tags are as good as they'll get." "That's right," Minato nodded. "So why aren't you off playing rounders with the guys or, talking to Yoshi?" She'd faint with happiness if you just looked in her direction. "Stop fucking around with a jutsu you already completed and work on getting some tail." "I've not completed it, I'm changing it," Minato said with a shrug. "Detection makes this a class supplementary technique at best, but with another dynamic I can easily make this an class offensive jutsu. I think I've almost cracked it, I just need to test a few things." Shikaku blinked. "Did you hear what I said?" "What?" "Minato, man, you're working too hard. I know you've been out here for 2 years, some of the guys think it's about time you had a break. They're worried you might be getting depressed or something." Now that surprised Minato. I feel perfectly happy, he said. Well, as happy as I ever was. What about the nightmares? Your bunkmates say they've been woken up a few times now by you thrashing around like a lunatic, Shikaku said blandly. What's that about? Minato shrugged, gaze wandering sideways. I have these dreams. I think I'm turning into a tadpole. Shikaku did not sound convinced. Don't take those rumors too seriously, okay? Minato began fiddling with his kunai again. Listen, it's your birthday soon, right? Yep. Minato scanned his surroundings, picking out 4 trees of varying distance from his position and 1 rock at the top of a steep cliff. One by one, he began to throw his kunai with steady, lethal accuracy, hitting each of his marks with a thud. Well, me and the guys were thinking that it would be nice to take a weekend off to celebrate. There's a town a few hours away with some decent entertainment. You're 16, right? You're a man now, you know. Gotta enjoy it. Yeah, said Minato, who wasn't really listening. Couple of nights in a soft bed, good food, you'll feel born again by Monday. There's this place, right, with some really nice girls who'll do anything if you name the right price, like, well, I don't want to spoil it. You interested? Sounds good. Minato had his eyes closed, his mind almost literally elsewhere, 300 yards away by that tree to be exact. The tag attached to the kunai gave him a rough mental picture of everything within 10 meters of the tree it was embedded in, like a fuzzy black and gray canvas. If a person was to walk across this canvas, Minato would see them as a blaze of life and chakra in white. If he threw a few of these kunai into an enemy stronghold, he would be able to tell the position of every enemy in seconds. But its usefulness until now had ended there. Hey, Minato? Shikaku piped up. You spoken to Yoshino about me at all? Minato reached out, as if to grab hold of an invisible kunai. He opened his eyes briefly in consternation, then closed them again. Belatedly he noticed he'd just been asked a question, No. Shikaku sighed and moved to lean against a tree and stare off in the direction of the communications tent. I don't think she knows I exist. I tried talking to her once, but she just kind of looked angry, and then I noticed she had her headphones on and couldn't hear a word I was saying. With a heavy push of chakra, Minato felt a sensation not unlike crashing through a brick wall. He staggered and gasped for the air that had been crushed out of his lungs. Then he realized 2 things. Firstly, Shikaku was still talking, but now his voice seemed quite far away, and secondly, Minato was standing in front of a tree with a kunai in it. Such a surge of jubilation rocked through him he almost cried out in delight. Not quite, however. He had to make sure this wasn't some kind of fluke. Minato looked to the next tree and tried to repeat the trick. He focused on the unique chakra signature of the marked kunai, moderated his own to match it, increased it, concentrated, rebalanced the positive and negative properties of force that affected the space between objects, and Minato gasped again as he plunged 300 meters to a new mark without moving. He did it again. He could no longer hear Shikaku droning on about his love life, which was an improvement on multiple levels. To the 4th tree. The world ripped past faster than his own brain could keep up. He was dizzy and out of breath and just so caught up in the immense excitement of success that he was beginning to hiccup with laughter. One moment he was by a tree. The next he was on top of a cliff, looking down at his friend who still gesticulated towards the camp. Minato waved. Oh, he shouted gleefully, at the top of his lungs. Shikaku spun around and squinted up at him. Even from here, Minato could see the look of confusion on his face, although it was getting a little blurry now and the horizon was tipping weirdly. It felt like all that space and time he'd just cheated had caught up with him. And thus from that day onward, it was known that the day Namikaze Minato cracked the legendary Hirashin Jutsu was the same day he fell off a cliff and broke his arm. Never in Minato's life had he ever seen so many people make such a fuss over one fractured ulna. "I'm fine, really," he tried to insist, but nevertheless at least 3 people insisted on carrying him to the medic tent, looking at him with such worry one would think he was dying. He'd never broken a bone before, and he had to concede it was a hell of a lot more painful than he'd imagined, but this was a bit much. One of the Yoshinos had lost most of her arm entirely and hadn't got this much of a fuss. Minato was lumped with the task of fending off a lot of unwarranted concern until the medic arrived, and she was not best pleased when she saw him. For a start, this casualty had interrupted her sleep, something she rarely got and obviously needed more of in order to be civil to people, and secondly, her medic tent was full of people who weren't sick. "Out," she shouted unceremoniously. "Out before you trample this place into the marsh." With a medic like this, Minato knew to watch himself. Not only was she in a bad mood, but she was Dan's older sister. He reasoned that since Jiraiya Sensei was important to him, and Tsunade was important to Jiraiya, and Dan was important to Tsunade, while Dan's sister was probably quite important to him, here was a connection that warranted especially good behavior. Minato tried to make not even one peep of pain as she grabbed his arm and seemed to decide the best way to look for a fracture was to shake until she heard a rattling sound. "Don't see you in here very often," she remarked grumpily. "Last time it was a dirk in the same arm, wasn't it?" "Yes, Akana-san," he said respectfully, his voice only slightly hoarse with pain. "How'd you manage this one?" she asked. "Catching more scouts, were you?" "No. I fell, Akana-san." "In a fight?" "No. I fell off a cliff, Akana-san." She looked at him with the same expression she might have worn if he'd said he'd been attacked by a duck. "Of course," she said dryly. "What else should I expect from Jiraiya's student? 2 years on the front lines, but his worst injuries are self-inflicted. Ha! Can't wait to tell the commander about this." She stretched out his arm curiously. Minato gave a helpless whimper. Ah. "Big boys don't cry," she scolded. "Now let me see, that's a fairly clean fracture." "That's good. At least you're considerate enough to make it an easy job, unlike some people. You should have seen Kanzaki's leg. Looked like his femur had been through the wood chipper when he came here. Compared to that, this'll be a doddle, but you'll have to wear a cast for 3 weeks. It won't interfere with my duty, will it?" Minato asked. "Of course, it will," she scoffed. "But if I give you a sick note for a self-inflicted injury, the commander will have both our heads and it won't be pretty. You'll have to buck up and be careful. No one gets out of their duty that easily." "But, I wasn't. I didn't mean." He mumbled, actually taken aback that anyone might think he'd done this deliberately. Akane just gave him one coolly arched eyebrow as she turned away to start preparing a splint for him. He probably could have tried to explain to her that he'd been testing out a new jutsu and he'd overdone it, using so much chakra that he'd fainted dead away, which had been just as well, because at least he didn't remember hitting the ground or feeling his bones snap. But did he really have to explain himself? If he'd wanted to go home he could have easily arranged for a more serious injury, one which no one would be able to say was his own doing. And the thing was, Minato didn't want to go home. Not really. Even if he lost every limb and every sense he possessed, he would still insist he was ready and able, even if he was only good for a paperweight. He didn't know why that was exactly. It wasn't like life on the front lines was a barrel of laughs, but Konoha seemed to hold even less appeal. Maybe it was because of his father, if there was one thing Minato was quite glad to be rid of, it was that man. Or maybe it was because his sensei was no longer in Konoha and he remembered life being pretty dull and boring whenever Jiraiya was away from the village. Or perhaps because Kushina was away too. Minato thought about that for a moment before brushing it off. It was the first time he'd thought of her in weeks, and it was unlikely she had anything to do with his aversion to Konoha. More likely he had just gotten used to life out here. Things were hard, and sometimes he missed the simple creature comforts he'd taken for granted in Konoha, but this had been his home for 2 years now. When he remembered his village, he remembered it through the eyes of a child. He no longer felt like the same person these days. Akane was just beginning to wrap his forearm in gauze when the commander stormed him. "What is this?" he demanded, pointing at Minato as if he'd never seen a broken arm before. "Boys will be boys, sir," Minato's medic sighed. "How is it you came to be injured in your own camp?" Danzu demanded, ignoring her. "I fell," Minato repeated. Why was this so hard for everyone to believe? "You fell?" Danzu repeated, looking as if he was about to launch into a full-volume tirade against him. Instead he turned to Akane. "How extensive is this?" "Nothing that will impair his duties, I promise," she said shortly. "Please, Commander. This is routine work, but setting a gutter cast is very fiddly. I'd appreciate if I had some peace to concentrate." So medics could banish commanders from their dens like any other lowly plebe? Minato heaved a small sigh of relief as Danzu turned and pushed his way back outside. On top of a broken arm, Minato didn't really want to be subjected to another of the commander's lectures, like the one he'd received when that child had managed to stab him. He never noticed anyone else being given an inquisition every time they suffered a paper cut. Why was it that Danzu only came to yell at him over, "Ow," he huffed. Akane was tugging on his hand quite painfully. "Don't be such a baby," she sighed. "My 4-year-old has more nerve than you. You wouldn't treat your 4-year-old like this," he muttered incredulously, biting his lip as she yanked his fingers. "I'll have you know Shizune has broken more bones than you have broken nails, and she has never once complained about my casting skills. The kid probably wouldn't dare, if she lived in fear of her mother as everyone else did." But Minato did not say that out loud. "Now shut up and let me work." When Minato eventually joined Shikaku outside the tent, his friend was looking more concerned than usual. "You all right?" he asked. Minato, armed with what felt like a concrete block around his wrist, gave it a demonstrative wave and nodded. "I'm okay." "You're going to sign it, right?" "I'll have to beat a path through the rest of your fan club," Shikaku snorted. The commander sounded pretty mad. Daisuke told him though, "Not me. That suck up." "I don't know why he's so bothered about it," Minato said, looking in the direction of the central tent where Danzu was probably quaffing fine wine and putting his feet up on the lowest-ranked chunin. "Maybe he thinks you did it deliberately?" Shikaku guessed half-heartedly with a shrug. "I didn't," Minato said quickly. "Why does everyone?" "I was there, Minato. I saw your dumb ass fall. I know it was an accident." The Nara boy scratched his head. "And people around here know you well enough to realize you're not the kind of person who stabs himself in the hand to get a free ticket home. But it wouldn't be the first time it happened, so watch yourself, yeah?" That's not what the commander is pissed about. Both Minato and Shikaku turned to glance at Akane, who had come to stand at the entrance of her medic tent for a smoke. Even though she'd joined in the conversation, she looked at them as if she wished they'd take it elsewhere. "Oh, yeah?" Shikaku did a good imitation of her arched eyebrow. "What's he mad at then?" She blew smoke at him, and Minato watched him try hard not to cough. "The commander will want to be especially careful of this one," she said, pointing her cigarette at Minato. "The Hokage's got his eye on him, and if something suspicious were to happen to him, say, he was injured or killed within the camp with no enemies or witnesses, Danzu would find his neck on the chopping block." "Why?" Shikaku asked, scowling. "What's so special about Minato?" "I'll write you up a list, shall I?" she answered sarcastically. "At the top will be that he's going to be Hokage one day." "Bull." Shikaku looked at Minato, waiting for him to express shock and disbelief too, but when Minato remained unresponsive his face morphed into wonder. "Seriously? Was there some kind of vote that I missed?" It's not official, Minato flubbed helplessly. I'm just a possible candidate. Way, in the future. Maybe. I don't think it'll happen. Akane sneered slightly. I hate modest people, she said. Luckily for you, people love that quality in leaders. I don't get why that would give Danzu trouble if Minato was hurt, Shikaku said. It's not like he would be blamed, is it? The medic widened her eyes at him, as if the answer was right there in front of him, but he was just too stupid to see it. Minato didn't get it either, and if Shikaku, the smartest person he knew, couldn't get it. She sighed at them, vexed. You youngsters don't keep up with your gossip, do you? She snapped. Everyone over the age of 30 knows Danzu wants to be Hokage. He wanted it bad back when Sarutobi was chosen, and though he's played it cool since then, everyone knows he still wants it. The Hokage knows it. If something suspicious were to happen to his favored successor while under Danzu's care, he'd think Danzu had something to do with it, Shikaku said, looking significantly at Minato at this revelation. Akane rolled her eyes. Thank you, Captain Obvious. Of course it's quite easy to deduct after I've spelt it out for you, she said, and ignored Shikaku's glare as she turned her focus back to Minato. So look at this way, you're pretty damn safe here. Danzu fears the Hokage enough to run around after you with a safety net wherever you go, and the Hokage knows that too. So spare a thought for the poor commander's nerves and try not to do anything as stupid as this in future. What if the commander tries to do him in? Shikaku pointed out. Don't even joke, she said, giving him a sharp glare. The commander is more dedicated to Konoha than anyone. He has a reputation for ruthlessness, but he'd never turn on his own men for political gain. Has he ever given you reason to doubt him? Minato recalled the last conversation he'd had with Danzu. Akane's assertion that he jealously coveted the title of Hokage didn't stack with the way he'd acted back then. He'd been encouraging, in his own strange way, of Minato's potential as a candidate, and if he was really so determined to be the Hokage, would he really have spoken like that to someone he considered a rival? Perhaps decades ago Danzu had wanted to be Hokage, but to say he still wanted that position today had to be pure speculation. As Akane had said, this was only gossip, after all. He looked at Shikaku's perturbed expression and smiled. Think I should start sleeping with one eye open? As if he didn't already. I wouldn't be smiling if someone pointed out to me that an elite ANBU commander had an interest in seeing me dead, Shikaku muttered. I think he would have tried something by now if it were true, Minato said. He would not start doubting his commanding officer over rumors. When the tools lost faith in the arm that wielded them, that was when Konoha would really be in trouble. You know they sent him out here because he was an agitator, Shikaku reminded him. So the rumors go. The Hokage also sent me out here too. He wouldn't have done that if he thought the commander was a real threat. Besides, I can look out for myself. Leaders aren't infallible, Minato, and neither are you, Shikaku said, eyeing his cast. That's your kunai hand. How are you supposed to fight now? Minato hadn't thought of that. He was naturally right-handed, and although like all nin he had trained his left hand to compensate for occasions just like this, there was no avoiding that his left hand was vastly weaker and less coordinated. Regardless, Minato shrugged. I'll manage. This weekend of RNR is looking more necessary all the time, Shikaku remarked. Minato had clean forgotten about his birthday. It was lucky he had far more observant friends like Shikaku who kept track of these things, or his 16th would have passed him by without incident. In truth, Minato could never be sure what month it was, or even what day of the week it was. Time stopped chugging along in its usual linear fashion when you lived life by a regimented routine that began again every day. It was easy to lose track and feel like you were trapped in a bubble, separate from the rest of the universe. Before he knew it, the weekend arrived and Shikaku, with a gang of acquaintances, bustled into his tent one afternoon to declare he'd better get ready, for they were off in exactly 1 hour to visit the nearest coastal town for a night of entertainment. There was to be no arguing or excuses. Everyone had decided, quite unbeknownst to Minato, that he had been working too hard and gone through too much without relent, and it was time for a break, even if all they could afford was one night. Although he went along with it all with a smile, Minato was not overly enthusiastic. He had hoped to spend his time off refining his new jutsu at a more sedate pace, and practice training with his left hand before the next mission. But his friends would clearly not take no for an answer, and though he suspected this was actually more about their enjoyment than his, they seemed determined not to leave him behind. And so off they went. During the 2-hour trip, Minato had to listen mostly to Shikaku droning on and on about Yoshino. Had she said anything about him? Did she like him? Was she prettier than Haruhi? Was there any way he could contrive to get to know her better? Why didn't you just invite her along? Minato asked. But Shikaku looked at him like he was crazy. That's a stupid idea. She'd never speak to me again. Minato thought this was just Shikaku's insecurity with his own conversational skills showing. He did not realize it was because his friends had some very specific entertainment in mind. Not until they arrived in the town and came to a stop outside a lively place of business called the Cat House. But there were no cats. Just women. Here. Minato's heels dug into the ground as they tried to usher him toward the entrance. Don't be a stick in the mud, Minato, one of his friends said. You'll enjoy it. No, I won't, said Minato with quite a bit of certainty. Isn't there a restaurant or a club, or this is a club? Shikaku was shoving him from behind. And it's a restaurant. A restaurant where women were actually on the menu. But Minato could not see a way out of this since he'd so obliviously agreed to go along with everything so far. His friends had tightened in a throng around him, not so much friends but some kind of unified rolling block that forced him forward when he'd much rather turn back. The woman waiting at the door greeted them with amazing warmth and pleasure. Welcome. She bowed low. Do you have a reservation? It was almost too much to hope his idiot friends had forgotten. The 6 o'clock birthday party, Shikaku said. Ah. The woman clapped her hands. Which one of you handsome gentlemen is having his birthday? Someone forced Minato's hand into the air. The woman's eyes found him and twinkled with delight. I see. How old are you? 18, Shikaku interrupted. He's 18. What the hell kind of place had they brought him to? So lucky. This must be your first time? The woman clapped her hands together with a gasp of happiness. Really, she was earning every penny they paid her. We may have to put on something very special for the birthday boy. Minato smiled weakly. Please, come this way. The rolling block moved once more, forcing him forward and into the clutches of this sinful establishment. Minato winced as he went through the doors, expecting something awful and lascivious and illegal in most countries, based on the kind of things his friends liked to talk about in their free time. He was slightly relieved to see the inside resembled a restaurant more closely than it did his preconception of a strip club, but it was a restaurant of a particularly raucous kind with women at every table, entertaining guests in a variety of ways. Minato's quick scan of the room revealed one woman sitting in the lap of one patron while another assailed his friends with a warbling song. There was even one taking off her clothes in that dark corner over. Minato jerked his gaze back to the fully clothed woman leading the way to a reserved booth, where a set of extremely pretty girls wearing colorful kimonos were waiting for them with welcoming smiles. Is this the birthday boy? One said. You can sit between me and Hari. His birthday party, he decided, had a lot of potential to be absolutely excruciating. This was just the kind of thing his friends liked so naturally they had assumed he would like it too if they could just get him to pull the stick from his ass. Perhaps there was something wrong with him, that he didn't see the appeal in being flanked by two gorgeous women eager to pour him drinks and ask him all kinds of personal questions as if he was the most interesting person on the planet. This was not relaxing, let alone even mildly comfortable. It was not that he was shy of girls, he'd never found them difficult to talk to, but then most of the girls he knew were not so different from boys. They sweated like boys, they swore like boys, and they loved nothing better to talk with him about the latest design of sword or tanto. This other breed of girl, the kind that got dressed up in heavy clothes and makeup and fawned over men, were something he didn't recognize. It would have been easier talking to this brunette if she was wearing grubby shorts and picking her nose. Why had that image come to him? "Oh, look at your poor hand," exclaimed one of the hostesses when he reached for a glass of champagne, for courage and fortitude, and his cast had knocked against the table. At the start of the week it had been pristine white. Now it was nearly black for all scribbled signatures and messages on it. "You have been in the wars, haven't you?" And she cradled his bandaged arm as if it were the most precious thing she'd ever seen. Minato was speechless. "He's not been in the wars," Shikaku supplied, already halfway through a bottle of shochu. "He's been fallin' off cliffs, ain't ya, Minato?" "You brave thing," the hostess said admiringly. "It must hurt." Minato nodded, even though in truth the pain was nothing more than a dull ache that bothered him less and less. "You boys go through so much to keep our country safe." "More wine," the hostess declared, which was met with an enthusiastic round of cheers from Minato's friends. But the wine was not doing more to relax Minato. Instead of loosening up and turning into the same kind of dribbling fool as the other boys, he only felt a more pressing urgency to stay on guard. He'd heard about these places. Pouring wine and making small talk may have seemed like good, clean fun, but Minato knew that there was more to their job than this, and as the evening wore on and the drinks flowed more easily and the conversation turned bawdier, Minato felt only increasingly nervous, as if he could feel something coming that he couldn't avoid. It came when Minato was watching Shikaku having his scars admired rather closely by one of the hostesses. Daisuke, who'd been sitting next to Shikaku, leaned over and whispered something in the other boy's ear. At once Minato knew something was up, as they both looked at him and then grinned. Then Daisuke was waving to one of the passing women, and said something discreet to her while pointing nonchalantly at Minato. Like a horrible chain reaction that Minato was helpless to watch unfold, the woman smiled and walked away, heading towards a staff entrance where a man stood as if on guard. The woman said something to the man, and then the man disappeared into the backrooms. Minato glanced briefly at Shikaku and Daisuke. Both were grinning at him like idiots. "What?" Minato whispered, dread seeping through his stomach like an acid pill. When he looked up to the staff entrance, he saw a new woman emerging, dressed in a loose-fitting kimono but with noticeably less makeup than the others. The moment Minato saw her, he knew exactly what she was. And she was coming this way. "You didn't," he hissed at his friends, whose grins only widened. Minato looked around for an escape. He was caged on either side by two hostesses, but perhaps if he jumped onto the table and legged it, no. That would ruin everyone's food. "I hear it's your birthday." His gaze jumped up to meet the woman now leaning sensually against their table. She had warm chocolate eyes and mahogany hair, and though he knew beauty was biologically predetermined, he almost felt the need to congratulate her for having such a beautiful face. Next to her, the pretty hostesses seemed almost plain. He said intelligently. "Why don't you come with me?" she asked, her voice that perfect husky pitch that commanded attention. "We have some other services I think you'll enjoy, birthday boy." Suddenly, Minato rather wanted to spend the rest of the night with the hostesses. They didn't seem quite so threatening now. "I don't think I have the money to, your friends have everything covered," she interrupted with a sultry smile. "Although I'd happily make an exception for you, my lamb." Minato's mouth felt incredibly dry. This woman was downright predatory and she was holding out her hand to him expectantly. Go on, Minato, egg Daisuke. Stop being such a girl and enjoy yourself, Shikaku said sensitively. This was what they called peer pressure, wasn't it? Minato felt the eyes of all his friends on him, urging him on, and he knew it would be rude to turn this woman away and most likely spoil his friend's fun. He swallowed and took her hand. Minato was only faintly aware of his friend's cheering. He felt a little numbed, as he let the woman lead him along like a mother with a child, for she was far older and taller than he was, through the restaurant and into the quieter passages behind it. She showed him up a set of stairs and along a corridor of many rooms, and there were sounds coming from these rooms, sounds which reminded him of the times when Yutane snuck into her boyfriend's bunk. The woman brought him to a room that was perhaps the first proper bedroom Minato had seen in 2 years. In his eyes, this was every bit as opulent and luxurious as Danzu's tent, even though it wasn't much more than a simple bed and a few other modest pieces of furniture. Would you like to sit down? The woman made an elegant gesture to the floor. Minato fiddled with the edge of his cast. Sure. She gave him a worldly smile as she went to a cabinet and began to fix 2 drinks on a stout, wooden tray. This is your first time, isn't it? He couldn't help being that obvious. I guess. There's no need to be nervous, she reassured. This is a natural rite of passage in a way. But Minato didn't understand many rites of passage that didn't involve blowing something up, and he was beginning to suspect the kind of man who took this passage was not really one he wanted to be. Look, he said, you're really nice, but I've kinda got a girl at home. It was a whopping lie, but she couldn't have known that. That's okay, she replied, coming over to settle the tray on the floor between them. She doesn't have to know, and I'm sure she'd understand anyway. No, she wouldn't. She'd hit me really hard, probably in the stomach, if she knew I was here. Belatedly, he realized he was describing Kushina. She smiled at him widely. Why? We're only sitting and talking. Would you like a drink? No, thanks, he muttered. I should really be going anyway. Why? What's the rush? What do you think is going to happen here? She quirked a soft eyebrow at him as she took a delicate sip of the tea she'd poured. I think my chastity is under threat, he said honestly. That's when the woman snorted, quite incongruously with her image so far as a refined, elegant creature. You're very sweet, she said, mopping her chin, but we don't have to do anything like that. I'm only here to make you comfortable. Perhaps all you need to be comfortable is an ear for an hour and perhaps a nice massage to ease those poor, tense shoulders. Can I keep my clothes on? Minato asked. We'll see about that, she murmured a little suggestively, not reassuring him in the slightest that her intentions were as pure and honest as she'd made them sound. Now let me just get my massage oils. She stood and walked past him, giving him a strong waft of heady perfume and scented bombs. There was another scent there too, he noticed, and as he listened to her rummage through a set of drawers behind him he wondered what that scent reminded him of so strongly. It was like a memory, a sense of nostalgia, a feeling instead of an image. What was it? A person? No, it was a place. A place like Minato threw himself forward and grabbed the tea tray. In a split second the delicate tea set was shattered across the floor, its contents sprayed across the mats and the walls, and Minato was on his back, tray lifted above him as a shield against the 10-inch stiletto dagger that had nearly ended him. The women looked down at him, as faintly amused as before, the tip of her knife deeply embedded in the back of the tray. You're very fast, she remarked. Minato was still recovering from the shock, but he stared up at her in profound relief. Oh, thank God, he whispered. You're an assassin. Pity it had to be this way. I would happily have shown a pretty boy like you a good time before sending you off to the next world, but alas, all men are the same, she sighed. They always want to skip the foreplay and go right to the main event. Virgins are the worst. She yanked her knife loose and shook the kimono off her shoulders to free her arms. Minato saw, with great relief, that she had bound her breasts like a normal kunoichi, and within these bandages was tucked a regular old kunai. This had probably been what had given her away. Carefully maintained weapons were kept well oiled and sharpened, and it was a flinty smell Minato had known his whole life. It had been totally out of place for a prostitute, a being from a completely different world, to smell so familiar. Now, she declared, flipping her hair back. Let's see if you can keep up with me after all, my lamb. No wonder she had seemed so predatory. She had been planning to kill him all along. But Minato didn't question this, and he only found it slightly strange to have apparently come across yet another enemy this far out of the official war zone. He was more concerned that his weapons were gone, most likely lifted from his person by this kunoichi when he'd been concentrating too much on protecting his virginity. Now all he had was this wooden tray. It would do. The enemy kunoichi's knives flashed as she struck out at him. They deflected off his makeshift shield with dull thunks and scratches. She tried to aim for his knee, but with a quick hop he stepped back and kicked the kunai from her hand and smashed the tray against her face so hard it broke in half. Momentarily blinded and stunned, the woman reeled, and Minato dove for the fallen kunai. When she turned to face him again her nose was bleeding profusely, but she didn't seem to care much except to drag her arm across her mouth to smear the blood across her face. She looked at the kunai in his left hand and the cast restricting his other, and smiled. "I'll bet that's your fighting hand too," she said. He shrugged, not used to such a talkative opponent. "Kinda shy, ain't ya?" she laughed, and launched herself at him again. Bigger and stronger, she crashed him into the wall and straight through the paper and wooden screens, and rolled with him, head over heels, each grappling for purchase on the other's weapon. Someone screamed. The room they'd burst into was already occupied. If Minato had glanced away from his would-be assassin he would have seen one half-naked prostitute and her thoroughly naked client leaping off their bed, and both quickly grabbed what clothes they could and ran from the room, raising the alarm. Minato hardly noticed. The woman had grabbed his injured arm and was twisting it painfully, hoping to exploit his weakness. He gave a shout as he kicked her in the stomach, throwing her off him. His kunai? Where was his kunai? He groped the ground dumbly but all he could find within reach was another tea set. The woman was coming at him again, he heard her quick footsteps on the mats. No time left. He grabbed the teapot and threw its scalding contents over his attacker. Boiling water hit her square in the eyes. She screamed and staggered. Minato saw his opportunity and took it. Moving in swiftly, he deftly snatched the stiletto from her trembling hand and plunged it straight up through her ribs, into her heart and out again. Her cries stopped dead. Her lung had collapsed. It was a perfect execution, and in moments she was dead. Minato was still standing there over her body when his friends, most of whom were heavily inebriated, arrived in the doorway. "We heard there was a fight," Shikaku said breathlessly. "We thought, oh, shit. Minato, what happened?" He shrugged, because he still wasn't sure of that himself. "She attacked me." "Why?" his friend frowned, coming over to examine the kunoichi's body. "Who was she?" Minato shrugged again. "An assassin, I think." "Targeting you?" "Why? Who sent her?" Shikaku ran a hand through his hair. "Why didn't you leave her alive? We could have questioned her." Minato had not actually thought of that. His body had moved as if he was on the battlefield. Someone like him was not used to questioning the motives of his opponents. You simply killed those who would kill you and moved on to the next life and death encounter. He had thought only of defending himself and neutralizing the threat. He raised a hand to his head and closed his eyes. He'd been out here too long, he'd become too comfortable with mindless killing. Now he was forgetting there was any other way. "You okay?" Daisuke asked him carefully. Minato just sighed. can we just go back to the base now? Finally, no one argued with him. Predictably, Danzu was outraged that Minato had yet again nearly managed to get himself killed. He lectured Minato at great length, and quite loudly, about the vice of the flesh being the downfall of many a great man, until there were few people left in the camp who didn't know Minato had spent his birthday in a brothel. His bunkmates found this hilariously shameful, not because he'd visited a brothel, oh, no. Minato's shame was in visiting a brothel and still emerging a virgin. He smiled patiently at their jibes and jokes, but he couldn't quite see the funny side. It seemed that no matter where he went, death followed. He could have incapacitated that kunoichi and questioned her, but he'd killed her without thought, without mercy. That aspect at least had pleased Danzu. He was becoming the perfect little tool, no longer mired by hesitancy. He killed men, he killed women, he killed children. A perfect tool was a perfect shinobi, and only a perfect shinobi could become a Hokage. If he wanted to bring an era of peace, first he'd have to slaughter his way to the top. What a funny old world it was. If Shikaku had hoped that taking him out for his birthday would make Minato less intense, he would have to ruefully admit that nearly being killed by a prostitute was not conducive to relaxation. Minato spent more time alone, training harder, fighting harder. Within a few months there was already talk of him being promoted to jonin, despite this being a privilege usually only gained by those in their mid to late 20s, if at all. A 16-year-old jonin was unprecedented, but for Minato the idea was met with general enthusiasm by his comrades. Even if it had only been a rumor, and Danzu had never thought once about promoting him, the commander was now forced to consider it as if it had been his idea now that so much support ran through the camp. Eventually a decision was reached, and Minato was called forth once more to Danzu's tent of extravagance. "I'm sure," he said to Minato, "you are aware that the possibility of your promotion has been heavily discussed between me and my captains." Until this point, Minato had merely brushed off this rumor, assuming it was about on the same level as the rumor that Saito Hideki had once screwed a sheep. "We have decided that although you have shown exceptional talent and drive befitting of a high-class chunin, you have not yet demonstrated the qualities of leadership and independence that the position of jonin would require. As it stands, I would not be comfortable assigning people to your care. Not until you have proven yourself, at least." Minato felt a small flicker of annoyance. He had not come here to demand a promotion and had never expected one, yet here Danzu was, talking down to him as if he was an upstart with an excessive sense of entitlement. "I shall keep that in mind, sir," he said, with a perfectly schooled tone. "Is that all you wish to tell me?" Danzu smiled wryly. "Not so fast, Namikaze," he said. "I say you are not ready now, for you have not yet been given ample opportunity to prove yourself. No doubt, soon, you will surprise us as you are prone to doing, and that is when we shall look to the possibility of a promotion. And I'm sure the Hokage will be very interested to see you progress." Minato looked at the encouraging expression on his commander's face, and suddenly the missing pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed began to fall into place. His heart, so close to soaring a moment ago, began to plummet. Before Danzu could witness any stray emotion he couldn't rein in, he bowed low and left the tent with a soft, respectful thank you. "Letter for you," Daisuke said, as Minato passed him on his way back to his bunk. Minato snatched the letter from the other boy's hands in a way that no doubt left Daisuke wondering what he'd done to offend, and went to read it on his bedroll. It was from Jiraiya, and for once it was good news. "The Salamander King is a tough old bastard," his sensei wrote, "but I think we've got him on the run now. He's named me and my team the Sannin. I hope it doesn't catch on. I was kinda hoping for something a little more personal and impressive, you know? Like, the magnificent Jiraiya, or something else you could wear a proper cape with. With this war winding down, maybe we'll see other soon." It was good to hear that at least the war with the Rain Country was going well, but Minato didn't share his sensei's optimism that they would see each other. The war with Kiri was pretty much exactly where it was when Minato arrived, and he didn't see it ending any time soon. He'd come here feeling hopeful that he would at least make a difference, but the stalemate could not be broken. Not by him. Not by some nobody chunin. He could be trapped here for years. Or, at the rate he was going, Minato could be dead long before it ended anyway. The day everything changed came just a few months later. Minato awoke in a camp that was alive with activity and talk, and he watched this all with mild consternation as took his shower and brushed his teeth. Something was clearly in the air that morning, but Minato was slightly more preoccupied with his face. "Can I borrow a razor?" he asked Shikaku. "No," said Shikaku at once. "I need to shave." "You don't need to bloody shave. You're blonde. No one can see your weak-ass beard." Minato scratched his cheek. "I can feel it though." "There's barely anything there," Shikaku said dismissively. "If you want to scratch that fluff off your chin, get your own razor. Or use a kunai." And so Minato arrived in the breakfast tent with a face cut to hell, courtesy. One a kunai that had been slightly on the rusty side. Thankfully, before anyone could comment, a strange hush fell over the tent. Minato looked up to see Danzu and one of his captains had entered. Normally they ate separately, so the only reason they were here now was to make an announcement. Minato wondered if the time had come at last. "As some of you might already know," the captain began, and several people including Minato moved to sit on the tables to see him better. "Kiri's outpost on the first island has received reinforcements that put their number at double what it was before." Minato's spoon fell into his bowl with a clack. "Well, shit," Shikaku sighed quietly to himself. "We have also received word from our spies that the reinforcements belong to General Aosue, who you'll most likely know as one of the 7 swordsmen, second only to the Mizukage in skill and one of the best military strategists alive. He is also at the outpost and it's suspected that they may be preparing to launch one massive offensive against this very camp. With their numbers and a strategist like Aosue leading them, it's very possible that we will be overwhelmed within a week." "I think I want to go home," Shikaku whispered, and he didn't look as if he was joking. Plenty of people around them were looking grim. "The situation is very dire," Danzu began, taking over from his captain. "But we may prevail if we act quickly and decisively. Frontal assaults against the outpost on the island have failed in the past, and with their numbers today it would be next to impossible to drive them out by force. However, with the new arrivals, the outpost will be seeing a lot of strange, new faces, and we have been presented with an opportunity to place one of our own among them who is unlikely to be detected. We have decided that in order to save this camp and our village and strike a devastating blow to Kiri, we will assassinate General Aosue." Minato remained quite still as everyone around him shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew what was coming, or at least they thought they did. Minato had a better idea of what was really going on. "While we fortify this camp and call for reinforcements, we need someone to infiltrate the Kiri base. This may be asking a lot, perhaps even asking the impossible, but we need someone of exceptional skill and talent and discretion to take down Aosue." Danzu's eye drifted over the faces of his subordinates as he spoke, as if looking for his assassin. This person must also understand the risks. Even once Aosue is down, escape is unlikely. But if this brave man succeeds, this could turn the tide of this war for good. Danzu's gaze lingered on Minato for far too long to be a coincidence. "I would like you all to think about this," the commander went on. "And any volunteers may come to my quarters tonight and," Minato stood. "I'll do it." All eyes turned on him. Danzu looked back at him slowly. "There may be no coming back from this mission, Namikaze," he said. "Do you understand that?" "Yes, sir, and I wish to volunteer," Minato said. Danzu smiled, but as usual, there was something unpleasant about it. "Indeed? How noble of you, how like Sarutobi, you are." He swept out with his captain, and after an awkward lull, people resumed their breakfast. But now the mood was dismal and everyone kept shooting furtive, worried looks at Minato. Shikaku grabbed his hand. I need to talk to you. Sure. Minato crammed the rest of his toast into his mouth as Shikaku dragged him from the tent and round to back to a secluded spot between two stacks of crates. There, he turned to Minato and folded his arms. You can't do this, he said. This is a suicide mission. Yes, I know, Minato said. Shikaku's foot bounced impatiently. I mean, it's a suicide mission, Minato. Danzu may be only too happy to send you off with bad info and malfunctioning weapons to make sure you definitely die, but the rest of us don't actually want to see you dead. Shit, the guy probably set this whole thing up just to try and get rid of you. He did. What? Shikaku's foot went still. He did what? Danzu is trying to kill me, you were right, Minato said simply. But then Accuse is trying to kill everyone, so I'll take my chances. Minato. His friend frowned at him in concern. When do you remember the prostitute that tried to kill me? Minato asked, as if any of them would ever forget as long as they lived. We never got to question her, but she was obviously an assassin meant for me. She didn't choose me at random. I know everyone else thinks you're the center of the universe, but don't you start thinking that, Shikaku joked, though he didn't seem to disagree. The only people who knew I was going to be there that night were you and our friends, Minato reminded him. Daisuke was the one who suggested the prostitute, right? Daisuke was the one who asked for her? Daisuke, the suck-up, who would lick Danzu's boots if the opportunity presented itself? Shikaku scowled. You're suggesting Daisuke is a traitor? No, I think he's perfectly loyal, to the commander at least. But the kunoichi was almost definitely sent by Danzu, and Danzu has been trying to manipulate me into taking a mission like this for a long time. And you're just going to let yourself be manipulated? Shikaku demanded. Put your foot down, say no. Ask for a transfer before he really does get you killed. Danzu may want me dead, but he's right too. Minato argued. Killing Accuse would be the greatest turnabout for this war in 10 years. This is worth the risk. No, it's not, Minato, you dumb ass. It's a trap. Shikaku shouted. You won't get within a mile of Accuse before his guards have you drawn and quartered, and even if you got to Accuse yourself, he's one of the fucking swordsmen. He'll have your head off faster than you can blink. Minato, you're not God. You're no match for someone like that. Someone's got to try. You're throwing your life away. If I can't make a difference, then I'm better off dead anyway. Shikaku stepped away from him, looking strange. I'm going to find Yoshino. I'll get her to contact the village and get you transferred back there. I don't think you're fit enough to be out here anymore. Do what you like. Minato shrugged and left him. Even if the order for a transfer came before the mission, Danzu would block it. He wouldn't want to waste this opportunity to send a rival into the clutches of an extremely powerful enemy. Shikaku could try to raise a fuss in the village if he liked, but in the meantime, Minato went to his bunk to begin arranging his weapons and scrolls. If he was going to take on a heavily fortified outpost and one of the 7 swordsmen, he would need to plan this carefully. His bunkmates came and went. Most clapped his shoulders and offered half-hearted support and good luck, as if they felt they were wasting their breath on someone who was already dead. A few, like Shikaku, seemed convinced he'd misheard the commander and that if they pointed out this was a suicide mission enough times, he might change his mind. Minato remained resolute, and when the time came he made his way to Danzu's quarters to be briefed. The commander and his captains showed him maps and layouts and made him memorize the Kiri salute and some, typical, Kiri name behavior, as well as a made-up name and rank in case he was questioned. Given that Danzu had an interest in seeing him fail, Minato wasn't sure how much stock he could place in this information, so he decided not to rely on it too much. He accepted the clothes they gave him, taken from a Kiri nin's corpse similar in size to himself, and was told that how he chose to assassinate the general was up to him. He was effectively on his own. As he headed back to his bunk to gather his supplies, he found his path blocked by Yoshi. "I heard you're taking that suicide mission," she began, biting her lip nervously. Is it true?" He shrugged. "I'm going on the mission, yeah," he said. There was nothing officially suicidal about it though, so he refused to say it. "Couldn't someone else go?" she asked. "It has to be someone," he said. "It might as well be me." "Yes, but she swallowed hard. "I don't want you to die, Minato." He smiled patiently. "Thanks, Yoshi. I wanted to tell you, so badly, but now there's no time," she whispered. Stupid. I shouldn't have waited this long." "Waited for what?" he asked. "To tell you to love you." "Oh," he said. "Okay." They stood awkwardly, neither able to look directly at the other. He began. "Do you want to be my girlfriend or something? You're going on a suicide mission." "Yeah, you're right. Sorry." He scuffed his foot against the earth. "Maybe after then?" She looked at him dubiously, her eyes wide and wet. It made him feel a little uncomfortable. "Do you really think you're coming back from this?" He shrugged again. No one else seemed to like his odds, so why should he? Yoshi sighed, her shoulders sagging. "I don't want you to go, but if I can't change your mind, at least let me give you something." This all seemed very familiar. The last time a girl had not wanted him to leave on a dangerous mission, she'd given him a good luck charm. Minato was just wondering what the hell had happened to that thing when Yoshi quietly leaned in and pressed her mouth against his. So this was what a kiss felt like. Sort of wet and soft and, kind of gross. Who'd invented this crap? Minato eased back as quickly as could still be conceivably polite. He smiled at Yoshi, who was really a very nice, pretty girl with fashionably long, blonde hair, and he'd always liked long hair on girls. But it was strange how her kiss had startled him into remembering another girl, a girl whose face he could barely remember. "What are you thinking about?" Yoshi asked. He did not say he'd been thinking about Kushina, and some long-forgotten warning about meeting exciting new girls. "About my mission," he said. Oh, she looked away, even more deflated than before. Perhaps he really should have been thinking about her instead? "This is kind of a bad time," he admitted softly. "Maybe we can talk when I get back." Tears rose fast in her eyes as she began to step away from him. "Right," she said, sounding angry. "But we both know that's not happening." "It's okay. I get it. You don't like me." "Yoshi, no, I like you, it's just you'd rather rush off on your little suicide mission than take a minute to talk to me." "I get it, Minato. You're just another guy who'd rather die than make time for me. I don't know why I ever thought you were different." She turned and stomped away. Minato was left speechless. He wandered back to his bunk and dumped his new set of clothes on the bedroll as he grabbed his old rucksack and began rummaging through it. Yoshi was quite gone from his thoughts. He simply was not capable of worrying about the possibility of a love life on the dawn of what was likely to be the last mission of his life, period. Conversely, what did worry him was finding that charm. In fact, he was growing increasingly frustrated that he'd misplaced it. He took the bag and held it over his bed and shooed it with such ferocity that even some of the lining began to fall out. Something plopped onto the bed by his knee. "Ah!" he cried and snatched it up, holding it to one of the lamps to make sure it was unharmed. Aside from some unnamed black gunk that was stuck to the back, the little amulet was just as he'd left it. Now he remembered why he'd put it away. He'd ripped it off so hard after one particularly devastating mission that the flimsy little clasp at the back had broken and he'd nearly lost it. But now more than ever he decided he needed a little good luck on his side, so he tied the amulet around his neck and knotted it at the back so that the only way to take it off would be to cut it off. He had never considered himself superstitious, but in this instance he could not explain why he felt so much easier with this thing around his neck than without it. He quickly changed the rest of his clothes, donning the dull ochre vest and a jade-green yukata that many Kiri nin wore. His Konoha forehead protector was exchanged for one bearing the Kiri symbol, and with this the transformation was complete. He strapped his supplies around his leg and made his way to the eastern side of the camp where his journey would begin. A crowd of his comrades were already waiting there to wish him farewell. A few were crying. None of them really believed they would see him again, and Shikaku was notable for his absence. The guy was probably still wrangling with Central Command, but it was too late. There would be no turning back now. Take care, Minato. We'll buy you drinks when you get back. Give that Accuse guy one for us. And then Minato set off across the delta, heading into the night and the heart of the Water Isles where hundreds of enemies awaited him. The Seven Swordsmen were famous throughout all the Shinobi nations as being a handful of the most formidable fighters in the world. They were also a very unknown quantity. Born out of the violent blood trials so many of Kiri's children were submitted to, half of them were mad, wild rogues who answered to no one. The ones who stayed behind, who pledged allegiance to the village that had brutalized them, were perhaps the most insane of all. Accuse was certainly not known to be an even-tempered leader, and Minato wasn't sure what to expect if or when he finally had his target in his sights. To conserve chakra, he swam the channel between the shore and the first island, then stayed low between the craggy cliffs to dry off and recover. He needed every ounce of strength. Every advantage he could ensure. He jammed one of his marked kunai into the cliff face, knowing that if things got tough, this would be his only escape, though he wouldn't hold his breath for his technique's effectiveness. It still took several seconds to activate, and that was already several seconds too long. Silently, Minato set off towards the island's outpost, mindful of avoiding the patrolling sentries in the forest. There seemed to be many more of them than he remembered, but slipping past them unseen was easy enough if he kept his wits about him. The outpost was a different matter. His camp had about 6 people on watch duty at any given time, but this place had no less than 30. With high walls and 5 watchtowers, Minato couldn't see a way in that didn't involve crossing directly into the line of sight of the guards, for the forest around the outpost had been cleared and the ground flattened. There was no way of crossing this barren zone undetected, and no doubt they had a barrier or two that would detect a stranger trying to sneak inside. Minato stayed at the edge of the tree line to assess the situation and memorize the general layout of the outpost. The maps Danzu had given him to memorize were roughly accurate, but there were far more people here than anticipated. They'd said 300, max. Minato would guess in truth it was roughly twice that. No good. Minato sighed and headed back out into the forest. He would have to do this the tedious way if he wanted into that compound. A sentry was easy enough to come by. He picked one wandering noisily through the bracken, bored and sulky and young. He wasn't taking his job seriously, and that would be his downfall. Minato dropped down from the tree above and knocked the sentry to the ground. In seconds, he'd broken his neck, and upon the dead boy's chest he placed a mark. This would have to be enough. Minato dragged the body as close to the compound as he dared and then retreated back to the furthest edges of the island to wait. This was a patient game he had to play. Eventually his superiors or comrades would notice the sentry was missing and come looking, although depending on their competency, that could be in just a few hours or a few days. But once they did, it was only natural that they would retrieve the body and bring it straight into the heart of their little outpost. And then Minato would have a direct ticket inside. He didn't have to wait long. Just a few hours and a couple of snack bars later, he detected movement around his corpse bait, and sat up to concentrate. It was just one person, perhaps the person who'd come to take over the sentry's shift, standing over the body, and examining it. This one quickly left, but a few minutes later 3 more bodies appeared. Then, as Minato had hoped, they picked up the body and began to move it. The alarm would be going out now that there was an enemy on the island. More sentries would be sent out and they would almost certainly tighten security around the outpost. They would not, however, be looking within their camp for their foe, which was exactly where Minato hoped to be before this forest was swarming with Kiri nin. He tracked the progress of the corpse carefully, as it passed through the gates into the compound and was taken inside some kind of one-room shack. There were multiple people in there, milling around, probably discussing the body and what had caused the death. Minato's foot began to tap a little impatiently. Was it just him, or did those swishing sounds in the forest sound like footsteps coming closer? Come on, people, he willed silently. I haven't got all day. Most of the people in the room disappeared from the scope of his tag's senses. Had they left? All he could detect now was one person, perhaps a doctor or a surgeon that had been left to deal with the body. Should he wait to see if this last person left or assume this was about as alone as this body would get for quite some time? He ran out of time. Tracks. Lead this way. You sure? Pretty fresh. Minato huddled down a little tighter behind his tree. He'd been followed. Perhaps these were just two sentries who'd stumbled across his tracks, or they had been sent out especially to look for him. Either way, Minato was out of options. If he tried to move away, he risked being seen. He needed to be inside that outpost now. And so he activated the jutsu and felt the now familiar rush as his body was jerked noiselessly 1.5 miles in a fraction of a millisecond. It was always disorientating. Minato swung dizzily for a moment before the overpowering smell hit him. He gagged. But he wasn't alone in this room he'd landed in, and the second he caught movement out the corner of his eye he dove for cover, hands still pressed over his mouth and nose to keep from breathing in that putrid stench. Ah, now it's gone, how curious. Minato didn't move, let alone breathe. There was too much of a chance that he would throw up if he took another lungful of that rusty, decaying smell, and that wouldn't look good on a mission report. Instead his eyes darted around, trying to identify exactly where he'd appeared and how to get out. Ayato, the marks disappeared, did you get the photograph? Ayato, you stupid boy. Footsteps faded out of the room and away down a corridor. Minato, assured he was alone, sprang up. It was an abattoir. There was no other way to describe this room full of bodies, human bodies, sliced open on tables and hanging from hooks. More than a few wore Konoha uniforms, and Minato tried not to look too closely. He didn't want to recognize anyone here. He saw daylight through an open door. Perhaps it was open to let fresh air in, but in through the same door came the insects and flies. Minato heard them buzzing around the corpses he fled past, and he didn't once open his mouth to suck in a breath until he was outside, standing around the back of a group of one-story wooden shacks. He breathed deeply, eyes clenched shut as he tried to compose himself. He'd always known Kiri nin were barbarians, but that this was a monstrosity that had not yet been reported. Minato lingered in this quiet little alley between the shacks until he could lift his head and resume a more nonchalant facade. His fingers squeezed the amulet around his neck for good luck before he stepped out into the busy courtyard, hoping to high heaven that no one would take one look at him and take him for what he actually was. Unfortunately, here was the thing about Minato, he was not just conventionally handsome, he was beautiful. The mark of a successful spy was his ordinariness. Having a bland, unmemorable face was key to slipping right through the heart of enemy territory without ever standing out or being noticed. So unbeknownst to Minato, the moment he stepped out into the open, he was clocked by several pairs of eyes. His first impression was that this was not even remotely like his own camp. There were 3 times as many people, for a start, and there was a cramped dirty smell in the air that always accompanied too much overcrowding in too little a space. But the people themselves were different too. The most prominent activity in this compound was one enormous ring of chanting individuals preoccupied with 2 sparring partners in their midst. At least, he thought they might be sparring. It could have just been a spontaneous brawl. A woman was watching him. She looked away when he met her gaze, but it was enough to put him on edge. She had only been checking out his pretty face, and wondering why she'd never noticed him before. Nevertheless, Minato took it as a sign to get moving. He was already attracting attention and rousing suspicion. Where was General Aosue? If he was anything like Danzu, he would be whiling away most of his time in the biggest tent or shack with every other high-ranked shinobi. Minato began to casually move in the direction of the most likely clump of buildings on the other side of the compound. He passed a group of Kiri chunin gathered around a barrel of water. "Picked off one of our guys this morning," a woman said. "They're getting desperate, those Konoha bastards. Probably heard Aosue is coming for them. I'd be nervous if I were them." "Screw them, I'm nervous," said the woman. "I don't like that guy. Too many teeth. He killed his assistant last night just because she dropped a book while he was sleeping, woke him up, you see. I don't care as long as he helps us win this war," said her friend. "And don't be so open about your criticism. If he'll kill someone for waking him up, he'd happily kill any of us for complaining, and you don't know who's listening." They both looked around suspiciously, eyes landing on Minato, who quickly began to move on. At least he'd confirmed Aosue was here at all. It had actually crossed his mind that Danzu might have made the whole thing up in an effort to reach for an excuse, any excuse, to send him off on a fool's errand from which he might not return. So just where was this general, anyway? "Oi, you!" Minato jerked to face the man pointing at him. It looked like a jonin. "What are you loitering for?" he demanded. "Haven't you got work to do?" "I'm looking for General Aosue," Minato answered with perfect honesty. He left out the part about why. "Aosue? He's over by the armory, but I wouldn't bother. If you waste his time, he'll probably kill you." "Thanks," Minato said, and he guessed that large building over there with all the weapons and armament stacked along its walls was probably the armory. He was aware of the jonin's eyes on his back as he crossed towards it. If the man thought he was untrustworthy, he clearly wasn't too concerned about stopping him from seeing the general. From the sound of him, the man was about as good to his friends as he was to his foes. Minato knew him the moment he rounded the corner and saw him. Aosue stood at least 2 heads taller than everyone else around him, and looked distinctly odd. Though it was fairly common for some Kiri nin to possess a few physical aberrations, the general took it to the extreme. His skin was the same pale, watery green as she marshes, and his hair was long and white and streaked with, was that samphire? And if this didn't tip him off, the enormous sword strapped to his back certainly did. Minato took one look at that weapon and swallowed. Anyone who could swing that around with any sort of proficiency was a force to be reckoned with. The general was berating someone. Some minor detail had not met his expectations and hell was being paid, and Minato noticed how everyone nearby was keeping several sword lengths away from him. This was not looking good. Although Minato had been winging it since the moment he'd arrived on the island, he had been hoping that the actual assassination could be quick if he could just slip casually past the general and slide a kunai into one of his vital points before he noticed an extra member of his entourage. But Minato could see that approaching Aosue now would be quite obvious. Only assassins and lunatics went near that man, obviously. And why hasn't he been caught yet? The general was bellowing at a comparatively small man. "We're combing the island, sir," the man replied, looking remarkably calm for a voice that trembled so. "If one of Konoha's people are trespassing, we'll find them. But so much time has passed, it was likely a scout who has long since gone." "Ah. They were talking about him." Minato sidled forward and joined the back of the crowd who were looking on. A few people glanced at him but most took no notice. The body was found less than a mile away from this outpost, far outside his patrol area. "Whoever did it wanted us to find that body." "Why?" The man's mouth worked. "You don't know. How do you know whoever did this has left the island?" Aosue demanded. Minato oozed forward through the crowd, slowly and casually enough to not even alert the people he was squeezing past. We've increased patrols, they haven't reported anything yet, the man stammered to his general. And have you checked our defenses? Have you made perfectly sure that no one has infiltrated this camp? The barriers have not been violated, said the man. If anyone had attempted to enter this outpost illegally we would know about it. I have been here all of 2 days and I could tell you 10 different weaknesses in your defenses here, Accuse spat. Don't tell me it's impossible for a rat to penetrate this place when it's riddled with holes. Minato had now situated himself at the front of the crowd directly behind the general. The kunai was in his hand, hidden by his voluminous green sleeves. He just needed to take a deep breath and go for the plunge. This mission might prove to be far easier than everyone back in his camp had insisted. To assure you, this camp is secure, sir. Then. What is this? 1 second, Minato had been lifting his kunai, ready to close the gap and end his mission. The next, he was staring down the length of a sword longer than his body, its tip barely an inch from the end of his nose. He stopped dead, hand frozen in midair. What a lot of fuss for such a small rat, Accuse said, looking him straight in the eye. That was when Minato noticed his mouth was full of many rows of sharp, pointed teeth like a shark, and his eyes had the queer, squashed pupils of a toad. Who might you be? No one of consequence, Minato said, looking around at all the nin who were taking out their weapons. He was badly outnumbered here. With the element of surprise gone, he had lost every advantage he had desperately needed to succeed. I'll give you credit for getting past the wards, Accuse said. But I'm insulted Konoha would send a babe to try and take me out. I think I'll send them a message, slowly, piece by piece, finger by finger. Minato acted swiftly. He threw down a smoke bomb and lunged forward blindly. But maybe those frog eyes gave Accuse unnatural sight, since he had no trouble reaching through the smoke to catch Minato's arm and swing him away, straight into the wall of the armory. Stunned, he had only enough time to grab one of the katana he'd fallen on and scramble up the wall and onto the roof before the giant sword sliced an enormous gash out of the building where he'd landed. The man was relentless. No sooner had Minato's foot touched down on the slates of the roof than he had to spin to avoid another sledgehammer blow. And it looked like the rest of the Kiri nin in this outpost were not content to sit back and let their superior fight unknown. Minato rapidly fired off a wind jutsu to deflect a rain of senbon and blocked a well-aimed kunai with the scabbard of his katana, all the while he slashed the chakra-charged blade of his sword at the general to keep him at bay. This was crazy. He'd taken on one of the 7 swordsmen and a whole outpost of nin who couldn't be defeated with the combined force of his entire camp. In desperation, Minato slashed apart his own sash and threw his yukata at Accuse to block his line of vision. He moved in fast, hoping that if he could just ram a sword through his heart and get it over with, he could activate Hiration and get the hell out of there. Minato had to halt and immediately will back as the general's body exploded outwards, inflating to such an incredible size his clothes ripped and spines rose, jabbed threateningly outwards, weeping poison. The man was a goddamn pufferfish. Minato threw a kunai, hoping he might pop like one too, but the blade, even charged with chakra, just bounced harmlessly off the general's pebbled green skin. What the hell did I get myself into? Minato thought wildly, diving off the roof to run between the shacks to gain some distance and some time to think. Hapless nin charged forward to confront him, but Minato cleanly cut them away. He had no problem with those who stayed well out of his way, but those who insisted on interfering met with a short, sharp death. Minato's flight was brought to another abrupt halt as the earth turned to impossibly sticky glue. Someone had quite the clever little jutsu. He fired a razor-sharp wind jutsu at the culprit, and before the man had even hit the ground, Minato had cut himself free of his own shoes to keep running. Where are you going? Accuse slammed into the ground before him, landing so hard he might have caused a crater. Minato raised his sword in defense. Although the general had deflated now, he was still larger than any opponent Minato had ever faced, and the way he handled that sword like it was no heavier than a toothpick was alarming. Still, his swings were, in Minato's eyes, slow and easily predicted. He ducked beneath each slash easily, and though he couldn't get close enough to land a hit himself, he knew that the legendary sword was no danger as long as he kept an eye on it. And at least when he was fighting in such close range with the general, no one else would dare attack him for fear of hitting their rather bad-tempered, murderous leader. "You have a familiar face," Accuse said, forcing Minato to cartwheel out of the path of his sword. "What relation are you to Namikaze Midoriko?" Minato slashed at the air, releasing a gust of wind that should have cut a normal person in half, but the general seemed to have toughened up his skin for this fight. It washed over him like a weak puff of air. Accuse barely noticed. "Are you her brother? Her nephew? Her son perhaps?" Minato did not have conversations with people he intended to kill. With steely calm, he was working out a plan, one final move that would decide who lived here today and who died. He just needed to find the right position. "You're a shy one, aren't you?" Accuse sneered. "I have nothing to say to you," Minato rebuked. "You sound just like her too. You are that stuck-up bitch's son, aren't you? What are you here for? Revenge?" The general laughed. "How fitting that I get to kill the mother and the child." Minato stumbled. He hesitated. In that brief, split second, Accuse spat a glob of ice-cold water at him and hit him square in the chest. Minato fell. The water closed around him, turning rapidly to ice and fixing him to the ground. Only his left arm remained free, and all he held in this hand was a kunai. "Ah, gotcha." Accuse straightened, swinging his sword up and onto his shoulder in triumph. "Did you actually believe that? Kid, I never met your mother in my life, but I reckon there isn't a neen over the age of 20 who didn't rip her page out of the bingo book and paste it onto their bedroom wall. You have her eyes, and her sexy mouth." It was no use struggling against the ice. Minato lifted his hand and threw the kunai as hard as he could. Accuse sidestepped it lazily, letting it hit the wall of the building a few meters behind him. "That was your last, best shot and you missed? That's pretty sad. Seems that talent isn't hereditary, after all." He moved to stand above Minato, lifting his sword, execution style. "Now, give a message to that coward Danzu for me." But as he swung down with enough force to sever Minato's head from his body, Minato disappeared. Witnesses in the final moments of that fight would agree that it was too fast to be any mere body flicker technique. One moment the blonde boy was pinned to the ground, about to die, the next he was standing beside the kunai in the wall behind Accuse. Then, quite simply, he reached out and touched Accuse in the middle of his naked back. Then he disappeared again, this time for good. Accuse roared angrily for the compound to be searched for the boy, to leave no rock or crate unturned. The brat couldn't have gone far, he raged. And when he was found he was to be kept alive so Accuse could have the personal pleasure of killing him, for no one had gotten away from him before. But soon the bravest of his underlings began to point out that there was something on his back. A mark. One which bore an uncanny resemblance to the mark the dead sentry had been found with. No amount of scrubbing or chakra cleansing could remove it, and when no sign of Minato could be found anywhere, the coroner who had been charged with investigating the sentry's body was called in for answers. However, the man had few. It might have been a tracking jutsu, he suggested. Or perhaps a doom jutsu. One which would, after a certain period of time, kill whoever bore it. General Accuse did not like this one bit, and when he retired to bed that night he demanded no less than 20 guards surround his shack, just in case the assassin returned to finish the job. He lay down with his sword in easy reach and assured himself that no green Konoha brat stood a chance against 20 of his best men. At midnight he awoke to a slight weight on top of him, and when he opened his eyes, he saw his blonde assassin above him. How had he gotten in? Why hadn't he hurt him? Why, was his bed full of blood? He screamed out to his guards, but by the time they entered he was dead. The guards, when later pressed for details as to how one of the most powerful men in the world had been silently murdered in his bed, could only shrug and say they saw a yellow flash and nothing more. Minato rather enjoyed Danzu's expression when he dropped the legendary sword at his commander's feet. He'd dragged it 20 miles just for this moment alone, to see Danzu struggle to hide his anger and disappointment behind the expected mask of pride and satisfaction. "You did well," he managed to force out, then absconded quite rapidly to his tent, probably to have a tantrum. "Well?" repeated Shikaku incredulously, who seemed to have forgotten that he'd previously doubted Minato's sanity. "You damn well brought down one of the swordsmen in the middle of his own base. That's fantastic. I got lucky," Minato said modestly. "Whatever. Everyone to the beer tent." Even though Minato really wanted to do nothing more than crawl into bed and curl up for the rest of the week, he was not getting out of the celebrations so easily. It seemed that everyone wanted to buy him a beer that night and wouldn't let him out of their sight until he was so drunk he ended up climbing onto one of the tables and enacting the parts of the fight he remembered, and plenty of stuff he simply made up. Then he recalled dragging a once more smitten Yoshi up with him, and kissing her in full view of everyone to raucous cheers and hoots, which was a much more pleasurable experience when your alcohol level was twice what was considered medically safe. When he woke the next morning he was greeted by a splitting headache. Someone had made off with his shirt and written something unflattering about his penis upon his stomach in permanent marker. Yoshi was curled up in the crook of his arm blessed with a permanent mustache, but thankfully she was still clothed. Mostly. He didn't remember much of what had happened the previous night, except a lot of laughing and kissing and groping of his backside by many more hands than Yoshi's. If there were blanks in his memory, it was possibly because he'd passed out several times. Right now he needed to wash the hangover out of his head, so he pushed himself up with a grunt and went in search of the shower stalls. "You the man, Minato," someone said as he passed. They tried to high-five him, but Minato missed entirely and staggered on in search of cleanly salvation. Under the shower head, he brushed his teeth and washed his hair. He stole Shikaku's razor and managed to scrape off his persevering beard growth with almost no blood loss. As he washed, he noticed the lucky amulet still hanging around his neck. He smiled, despite his headache. Perhaps it had brought him luck, after all? Ahem? Minato glanced around and jumped. Yoshino, Shikaku's Yoshino, not his own Yoshi, was standing on the other side of the modesty screen. Although she was turned away and deliberately not looking at him, Minato still felt scandalized. "What are you doing here?" "It's not the girl's hour yet," he said, diving for his towel. "Actually it is," she said, looking at the sky. "But I don't want a shower, I need to talk to you." Towel wrapped firmly around his waist, he went over to join her by the screen. Only then did she turn and face him. "What is it?" he asked. "I just got word from the village," she informed him primly. "They want you to return there as soon as possible." Minato's heart began to fall. "If this is because of what Shikaku said then, no," Yoshino interrupted. "No, it's something else. They, want you to claim a body." "A body?" he repeated. She consulted a note in her hand. "Someone called Nanomiya Mototsun, does that mean anything to you?" Minato leant heavily on the screen. "Yeah," he said, feeling like air was suddenly a little too thin. That's my dad. Dear Hokage-sama, it is my great pleasure to inform you that the resistance along the Water Isles has been absolutely and incontrovertibly crushed and Kiri forces have been driven back into the water country. The victory has been hard-won, but I do not believe it could have been possible without General Aku's sudden death and the subsequent fear and disorganization this inspired in the Kiri forces. For this, we must thank our prodigy, who has exceeded expectations. Without him, this war may have been lost. It is my impression that over the years he has become a formidable soldier, cunning in strategy and unflinching in execution. I do not believe anyone but this boy could have taken down Aosue, and now I hear reports of his growing legend in Kiri. He is being spoken of there as the Yellow Flash, and those who bear the mark of his jutsu are marked for death. It is more than we could have hoped for. I still remain cautious of the plans you have for him. In my opinion, he is growing arrogant and reckless and has begun to challenge authority in a way that may prove dangerous. But in all areas of consequence I believe he has proven himself to be a fit jonin, and I heartily endorse such a promotion in the near future. While our enemies spread his name and fear of his myth grows, I believe he will prove to be a valuable figurehead for this village. As long as Namikaze lives he will be feared, and so will Konoha. Yours loyally, Shimura Danzu. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.